France, Germany, the UK and the US have held talks in Berlin in an effort to try and agree a joint position if Russia decides to invade Ukraine. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken met his European counterparts before he heads to Vienna on Friday to meet Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. The last 2 weeks have seen several rounds of talks within Europe as worries over the rising number of Russian troops along Ukraine's borders have increased. While the US and Germany have emphasized the importance of continuing talks with Russia, both agree that Moscow's actions will be met with consequences.
We urge Russia to take steps to de-escalate the situation. Any further aggression will have decisive consequences. We fight for the continuation of the European peaceful system, which is existential for us.
Russia is continuing to escalate its threat toward Ukraine. We've seen that again in just the last few days with increasingly bellicose rhetoric, building up its forces on Ukraine's borders, including now in Belarus. Russia's repeatedly turned away from agreements that have kept the peace across the continent for decades. And it continues to take aim at NATO, a defensive voluntary alliance that protects nearly 1 billion people across Europe and North America, and at the governing principles of international peace and security that we all have a stake in defending.
Russia says NATO is also raising tensions as Poland, Lithuania and Ukraine all increase troop numbers, something Moscow says it will be compelled to respond to.
We share the concerns of Belarusian colleagues and allies that NATO has been beefing up its military presence along the external borders of Belarus. They do not provide any explanations, none whatsoever. It's obvious that these are provocative actions, but they do not feel any need to give any explanations or justification. In this regard, Russia and Belarus are compelled to counteract adequately. This includes combined policing of the airspace, regular joint training, drills, and so on.
Let's bring in our reporter Kate Brady in Berlin, the center of frantic diplomacy today. Good evening, Kate. Good to see you. So this was a day of forging a common Western position here before the Blinken-Lavrov talks later this week. Do they have something up their sleeve to defuse the crisis?
Well, concretely speaking, the main strategy right now is dialogue, dialogue, dialogue. And we've seen that in the flurry of diplomatic talks that have been going on around Europe this week between NATO allies. And that's something that German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock reiterated during Antony Blinken's visit today. She said that the only way out of this crisis is a political one, reiterating again the need for more dialogue. But the allies did also today discuss possible sanctions should there indeed be a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And one of those options could potentially be or involve at least this controversial Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, that pipeline that runs between Russia and Germany, which is now completed but hasn't yet been signed off on the German side. Now, Germany is reluctant to halt the final approval of the pipeline, saying they would rather not use it as leverage against Russia should there indeed be an escalation at the border to Ukraine. But Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, really upped the pressure on Germany today, saying that the pipeline should and could indeed be used as leverage against Russia because there's not yet any gas running through it. So certainly upping the pressure here on Germany, and it would certainly put Berlin in a very tricky corner should there indeed be an escalation on the border, which would most likely, as we've heard from Western allies and NATO allies, would most likely result in some very serious consequences and economic consequences as well for Moscow.
And Kate, what are the expectations of the Blinken-Lavrov talks? What are you hearing?
Well, the one thing that we do know Blinken will take with him now, at least, is the united support of NATO allies as he meets with Lavrov. But it's still not clear exactly whether or not Moscow really sees anything on the table right now that's really worth talking about. The bottom line is Moscow wants NATO allies to promise that Ukraine will never become a member of the NATO alliance, something that NATO allies have completely rejected, saying that Russia has no say in what military alliances and groups other countries become part of. So it's really unclear as to whether or not there's really any room for manoeuvre right now by discussing other issues as well, whether it's the placement of missiles or where military exercises are held. Of course, we'll have to wait for the result of those talks tomorrow between Blinken and Lavrov, but it's looking extremely unlikely and very difficult right now to see where there's much room for movement on that front.
All right, Kate Brady there in Arctic Berlin for us. Thank you very much. France and Germany, the EU's most powerful member states, were involved in today's talks, but the bloc itself has been left out. Let's now head to Brussels and our correspondent Shona Murray. Good evening, Shona. So the bloc will be crucial when it comes to implementing more sanctions against Russia. Do we already know what measures we could look at?
No, not at this point, Stefan. We know that the EU just before Christmas was very much aligned when it came to the fact that there would be massive economic consequences against Russia and unfortunately against the Russian people as a result, if there is some sort of invasion of Ukraine. And as you mentioned there, of course, the bloc wasn't represented this week in any way in those diplomatic efforts. But the EU will have to shoulder a huge amount of responsibility if there is an invasion, because as we know, NATO or nobody wants a military confrontation. It'll be down to massive economic sanctions. It'll also be down to the EU to take in any refugees if that's the way things evolve. So I think, you know, the EU does have quite a strong level of responsibility here. Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, was speaking at Davos today, and she reiterated the EU's promise that there would be huge consequences for Russia economically if there is an incursion in Ukraine.
If the situation deteriorates, if there are any further attacks on the territorial integrity of Ukraine, we will respond with massive economic and financial sanctions. The transatlantic community stands firm on this. The European Union is by far Russia's biggest trading partner and by far the largest investor. And yes, this trading relationship is important to us, but it is far more important to Russia.
And Shona, Friday obviously a big day for diplomacy. What will Brussels be looking at?
Well, I think first and foremost, whether or not diplomacy still has a chance, Stefan. I mean, we saw last week that the really intense diplomatic efforts didn't yield a huge amount of results. So that's key, because as we even heard from Kate there, the implications of an invasion of Ukraine will be huge, whether it comes to European energy, whether it comes to the loss of life. So it's a very serious situation that we're in and very hard to come back from if there is an invasion. Another thing that obviously everybody would be looking for is to whether or not Vladimir Putin knows what he wants to do or what his intentions are over the next few weeks, whether there will be a military incursion or whether we're seeing saber rattling. We heard from Joe Biden in the White House yesterday. He said that he believes that Vladimir Putin will engage militarily. He even said maybe a small incursion. But as we heard from the president of Ukraine, there's no such thing as a small incursion. So everybody will be watching to see what's potentially going to happen over the next few days and a few weeks, and the outcome really could have huge consequences.